All right, let's jump into it. So today's session on user adoption, and especially part of the strategy series, what we're going to really touch on here today is how to measure user adoption. And it sounds like an easy concept. It sounds similar to a lot of things. Oh, the more users, the better. The more sessions, the better. The more applications, the better. It's not always the case. We live in a world where you pay for your urgency, you pay for speed, you pay for data freshness. So, not necessarily more is not better. Faster is not necessarily better. It is about using correct metrics, and the correct metrics will be what's correct for your organization could be correct and sized and right sized differently for somebody else. So that's what we're going to talk about here a little bit today. So let's talk about usage versus value, right? Um, Even on a refresh interval speed, if you have the usage, if you have the ability to be refreshing a dashboard hourly, but the data doesn't reload until daily, or maybe even the decision makers only get a chance to look at it daily, you're not really doing yourself a service from the user adoption standpoint of getting people to use that dashboard. You're using up reloads within Qlik Cloud, you're taxing your systems, and you're letting the data change more frequently than users are even having decision making windows around it, right? So thinking about what is adoption. Adoption is getting people to use it for the right job. In this case, something that is on a slower refresh interval might serve better off as an email distribution alert or an application, an iOS, notification alert, something like that. So understanding the usage versus the value that it's providing, just because you have the ability to do it doesn't necessarily mean you should be doing it. Talk about that at the end here. Again, what is adoption? Adoption is success is different to everybody in this instance, where um, you could have several users, several developers come onto the platform, and that could be your method of adoption. Or you can have several new divisions within the organization come onto the platform, and that can also be a successful definition of adoption. So it's important to understand as an enterprise what is adoption, and it's different for everybody. So there's no right answers, there's no wrong answers. We're going to talk a little bit about telemetry metrics today. What is measurable in Qlik Sense and Qlik Cloud? What is kind of comes out of the box? What you can add? Some different things, maybe around migration, but really just how to kind of monitor those logs and different things like that. And then, kind of to wrap it all up, the last part I want to leave here is kind of just a note on Goodhart's law, which is more or less around the idea that just because it's a measure doesn't mean it should be a target, right? Where just because that measure is attainable, once it becomes a target to hit, you're almost de-incentivizing it the wrong direction. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So moving on, keep this session quick. So again, into usage versus value. I have a chart in here to kind of explain, or before I get into that there's different types of usage now. And what you previously thought, it's like anything else. You previously might have thought, okay, what are some good metrics of measurement? It's the number of apps I have, the number of users I have. Well, in reality, those are almost bad things now. When you have more data floating out there, you have more bloat, you have more infrastructure support to answer those questions. It's not necessarily a good thing. You really want to think about this inversely. And you want to say, hey, what are my good metrics here? It's my time saved. It's my problems reported. It's actually the absence of infrastructure. So that is really what I want to challenge you to think about this session, is that a successful deployment and a successful application is really what it does in its absence. What are you able to remove from the user in other places? Are they now logging into just Qlik instead of 3 other tools? That's a win. Are they now logging in once a day? That can also be a win. If they had to log into 3 different systems to do a report, log in again to finish it, then come back after lunch because it took so long and now it's just a one-stop shop, on a metric side, they're doing less touches. You would say, oh, they're using the systems less, but it's really a win. So again, it's thinking about how do we measure the value and what is usage. So to kind of summarize that, I have a table here on the right side that shows some other SaaS-based products, some other companies, and it just shows that how they value. And a lot of this is around pricing, right? You're going to usually how the company values the product is how you're going to pay, the pricing side of things. But again, kind of like you'd expect, HubSpot, it's the number of marketing contacts. And then now within HubSpot, they value it within the role that the HubSpot user takes. But there's every company is going to have different ways to value these metrics. So again, what is success? What is adoption? What is value? If someone can answer the same question by logging in once and having all the information at their fingertips or getting an update on their phone, that should be treated just as equally as before they used to log in 10 times to get the data. They're doing less with more, or sorry, more, they're doing more with less. So that should be rewarded, and that should be, measured appropriately, right? All right, this slide I copy and pasted directly from Qlik, but it shows kind of what telemetry metrics are out there. And this is Qlik Cloud. Qlik Sense measures things a little differently. It's more focused on the storage space and your RAM usage. But really, Qlik Cloud, you're measured on what you're paying for. So your telemetry, your data for analysis, that's going to be how much data you're pulling into the data models once it's expanded on a monthly basis. It's not how much data is stored. It's not even how much data how much it's reloading. It's a combination of it, but it's net new values. Data moved is going to become more relevant when you get into the talent products. That's more focused around like pipeline capabilities and some endpoint access and things like that. So less appropriate here. Okay, moving on. I'm going to skip over the next couple. These are more third-party transformations and Open Lakehouse. Those are almost exclusively for Qlik Talent products. So we can expand that later. But this whole point has been on Qlik Cloud Analytics. So the next thing you're really measured on is your automation runs. They also lump these in with reloads now. So when you get your bucket of reloads and automation runs, that includes both. So plan accordingly. If you're migrating, if you're doing 1,000 reloads a month and you migrate, you're not just going to have your 1,000 automation. You got to leave room for your 1,000 reloads plus whatever automations you're now going to make, because you can't make automations in Qlik Sense, right? So automations and reloads are now 1 and 1. And then the last metric they measure here are the reports. So anytime you're generating a report that's kicked out of Qlik Cloud, whether it's scheduled to the reporting service or even as one of the email distributions, if you're subscribed to those will ding you a report. It kind of runs the bell of the report. So it's important to understand how you're charged to know where you're going to go from there. That can kind of help you scale appropriately, and it can help you focus on what to measure. This is how Qlik measures the product. It doesn't mean you should measure your success that way, right? But you can. All right, talked about this earlier, but to kind of round it all out, Goodhart's law, when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. This is kind of summary of it. But again, just to highlight that if you're incentivizing a target, it now can incentivize ulterior motives. So like I said before, great example I can think of is, you have a dashboard, you're incentivizing users to go use it, but if they're getting the information that they need right away, you don't necessarily want to incentivize session time. If just because it takes someone a long time to get the information, it's not a good thing. It's not more is better. It's not more visitors, more success. They're spending more time getting the same information. It's almost a bad measure, right? So think about it that way. Just kind of a way of inverse thinking here, where you really want to measure. I kind of think of it like measuring by abstraction, where a user should be measured on how much time they're not logged in. That's a really good metric. All right, switching gears here, we talked about user adoption. Some ways, we're going to talk about some ways kind of to check on those telemetry things, whether you're in Qlik Sense or Qlik Cloud. So the first way, this is relatively new too, is timestamping this episode. It's the end of April 2026. But to timestamp this, so this is relatively new here. It came out in November, but this is the content monitor. And if you've done a patch on Prem lately, it's been applied in there. Now you've seen it in your monitoring apps. But this largely replaces a lot of the operations monitor. And it also replaces a lot of the information that they were starting to put into the cloud readiness applications. That would kind of do your environment scan and tell you what apps are ready or not. So the content monitor, you can if you don't have it, you haven't patched, you can install this, but there's a lot of good sheets in here, and you'll recognize a lot of the sheets really contain the same information around like your session usage, your app summaries, your detail information, task executions, all that, but it is organized a lot better, right? So this is one way to measure it. Oh, there was a picture in here, but your content monitor is really kind of be your new one-stop shop for everything. There's a lot of great information in there, and it can measure everything that we talked about today. The next kind of way to think about this is this is the GitHub repository for the Qlik Cloud monitoring apps. And you can see they've released quite a bunch here that you can download these from the GitHub repository, can configure them, set them up, and you get some really good insight in here. I'm not going to go through them all. I want to show where that they're available and they're out here. But you can see we have things like your app analyzer that can contain a lot of like your session information, things like that. You have your automation analyzer. This could be a brand new concept. Reloads really focused on what's chained, what's tasked, different things like that. And then when you go to it, it gives you a nice little, you can download it right from here. It's going to give you a nice little configuration guide that you can install the QBF right here as you configure it. And then they even give you kind of a preview and a little walkthrough of what it's about, what's included. So you kind of get a sneak peek. So this is a great addition where if you're trying to just out of the box track your apps, this is a great way to get started. And, the sky's the limit from here. So again, first, what do we talk about today? It's defining success. It's defining what is user adoption. User adoption isn't just making a successful application. It's not making an application that a bunch of people log into. You really want to flip that around and say, how can I make an application where people stop logging in? People get information sent to them. People can click a button to subscribe. People are doing their job seamlessly, and your data starts working into the fabric, right? So that's what I got here on today's session. Tune in next week where we cover some more of the ROI and the value proposition about this. But we'll see you soon. Thanks.